This is a quick review for the checkup on page 9. If you understand the concepts that I talk about on this page, you should be able to do the checkup without looking back. The things that you need to know before you do the checkup is how to solve radical equations and how to solve incomplete quadratic equations. That's what we've been doing in the previous pages. We've been solving radical equations and we've been solving incomplete quadratic equations. Well, let's do a review of how to solve radical equations. The first step in solving radical equations is to isolate the radical. In other words, get the radical by itself on one side of the equal sign. And then the second step is to remove the radical by squaring both sides of the equation. So let's do these two steps here in this equation. I've got to isolate the radical, that's step 1, so that means I've got to get radical x by itself. Here I have a 9, and there's no sign in front of the 9, so that means it's a positive 9. So I'm going to use the inverse operation of a positive, which is a negative 9, to get rid of this 9. But what I do to one side, I've got to do to the other, so I'm going to take away 9 on this side. Okay. What I have left is negative radical x equals negative 9, or 2 minus 9. Well, the signs are different. The 2 is positive, the 9 is negative, so that means I'm going to subtract 9 minus 2. That gives me 7. And since my bigger number is negative, my answer is going to be negative. Okay, remember that when you're subtracting or adding, and the signs are different, you always subtract, and then the sign of your answer is going to be the sign of the bigger number that you subtracted. Okay. Now, another thing that you've got to remember is that when you have a negative on both sides of the equation, like you do here, it automatically becomes a positive. So now what I do is once I've isolated the radical got it by itself on one side of the radical of the equal sign, once I've isolated it, I remove the radical by squaring both sides of the equation. So I'm going to square both sides. That's going to give me the square root of x squared is x. And 7 squared is 49. So x equals 49. So the way I solve radical equations is by 1, isolating the radical, and once it's isolated, removing the radical by squaring both sides of the equation. Make sure you know how to do this before you do the checkup. The second thing you need to know before you do the checkup is how to solve incomplete quadratic equations. Okay, these are the steps of solving an incomplete quadratic equation. The first step is that I've got to isolate the variable. After I've isolated the variable, I've got to use the radical function to remove the square. So let's do this problem here. I've got to isolate the variable. Before I isolate the variable, before I do anything, I've got to cross multiply because I have two fractions, one on each side of the equal sign. So that means I've got to cross multiply. I'm going to multiply the 2 times the negative 6. That's going to give me negative 12. And I'm going to multiply x plus 4 times x minus 4. X plus 4 times x minus 4. Remember that when I'm multiplying parentheses, I multiply the first term times everything inside the second parentheses, and the second term times everything inside the second parentheses. So let's do that. X times x is x squared. X times 4 is negative 4x. Then positive 4 times x is plus 4x. And positive 4 times a negative 4 is negative 16. Now I'm going to combine these. Positive 4x minus 4x is 0. So what I have left is x squared minus 16. Now I can start talking about isolating the variable. I've got to get x squared by itself. So to get x squared by itself, I've got to get rid of the 16. So I'm going to add 16. Negative 16 plus 16 equals 0. But what I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So I'm going to add 16 over here. Positive 16 and a negative 12 equal a positive 4. I've just isolated the variable. See, the variable is isolated. It's all by itself. Well, after I isolate the variable, I use the radical function to remove the squares. So the radical function is this. So what's the square root of x squared? Well, what's the square root of 4? Plus or minus 4. And what's the square root of x squared? X. So this is my answer. X equals plus or minus 4.